introductory stuff, I drilled you guys on what I would consider to be ABC type statements. And you started out like failing remarkably. It was painful to see that you guys were unable to string together the basic thread of the first few chapters of the Gita. So I made it a point to really force feed you guys the first 4 or 5 chapters of the Gita, the primary lessons, Sankhya and Yoga, what those terms mean in the second chapter, how those terms are glossed as Jnana and Karma Yoga in the third chapter, how that evolves into Yajna, which is for people who aren't quite ready for Karma Yoga yet, how that teaching on Yajna continues into the 4th chapter and becomes Dravya, Maya, Yajna, and Jnana Yajna, and then how the 5th chapter deals with the same basic topics of to act or not to act, but this time conceived of as yoga and sannyas. Then sannyas again gets glossed as Sankhya in the 7th chapter, in the 5th chapter, and that really makes up the first 4 chapters, first 5 chapters of Gita. This attempt by Krishna to reach a samanvaya, or a harmonized conclusion about whether to act or not to act. So we did that, and you know, there's different ways of learning. One of the One of the primary ways of learning is memorization. And memorization has its limitations because life is variable. There was the father of the ecological approach to teaching. Was a Russian guy named Bernstein, who was commissioned to, after World War I, to study what it was that made good blacksmiths, and bad blacksmiths. They were cutting sheet metal with a hammer. He was studying what made an expert blacksmith versus a non-expert blacksmith based on how they would. The expert blacksmith would always hit the same spot, and the novice blacksmiths weren't able to hit the same spot. Just close the door if you need to, the front door if you need to. Easy solution. All sorted out? Okay. No problems? Okay. And so anyway, Bernstein, he studied the movement patterns of the expert blacksmiths, assuming that they would make the same stroke every time, using a primitive cyclography technique, where he put light bulbs on somebody's arm and body and then took high shutter photographs of them. We were very, very fast photographs of them. As they moved, then you would see a wave of light from the fast shutter speed, on the photographs, and you see a wave of light where they. It's how they do CGI now and get CGIs to move in a human-like way. So anyway, he did this, and he found that the blacksmiths did not actually, the expert blacksmiths who always hit the same spot, they did not have a uniform swing. In fact, they would swing slightly differently every time. Their expertise was that they would make micro adjustments to their move as they were moving. So by the time they got to the spot, they would always hit the same spot. But they did not make the same stroke because human beings are not made to do the exact same thing over and over again. Our heart does not even beat regularly. Our heartbeat changes. In fact, as you're getting close to a heart attack, your heartbeat becomes very regulated, which means that the more regulated your heartbeat is, the exact space between your heartbeats, the closer you are to death. And in a healthy stage, there's irregularity to your heartbeat. There's also microsaccades, small movements in your eye when you're staring at something. Your eye vacillates ever so slightly. And so this movement is part of life, and variability is part of life. And when you try to make everything exactly the same every time, it's actually unnatural, especially when it comes to physical movements that human beings do. We don't do our best work when we just have to memorize stuff. And in fact, when you get overwhelmed in a high-stakes situation, if your movement isn't natural, then you'll go back to what you learned, and you'll never be able to replicate what you learned, and you end up choking. And what makes people who are able to work in a clutch situation where they don't choke with high stakes is they have not learned in that information processing way where they're told exactly the right way to do things, and then they have to copy it. Because human beings aren't made to just copy the same thing every time. And so Bernstein called this repetition without repetition. They would get the repeated thing where they would strike the same point, but they would make different strokes every single time. Anyway, they've studied this in terms of sports, and a better way to learn sports and movement in general is to be given goals to achieve, but to allow your body to achieve those goals in a way which is natural for it, as opposed to thinking there's only one right way to do things, and you force everybody to conform to that because people are different. They have different abilities, they have different aptitudes, they're naturally attracted to certain movements. And so part of coaching is learning to work with those innate qualities. Instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, a perfect round hole, you let them do their own thing. Just like they had half a dozen, 8 potters from France and potters from India make perfectly spherical pots on a potting wheel. And they looked at how they did it, and they all did it differently. Although the French people were more akin to one another because of cultural similarities, because they grew up in the same environment, watching the same techniques, and then the Indians did it the same. But everybody had different hand movements, but they would get that perfect, all the pots ended up being perfect. So ideally, when we look at something like studying a philosophical text, it's not just free form. There are the constraints that the text provides. There's just no way to get around that. And so you're working in a system with certain constraints that are imposed upon you just simply because you're reading a text written in a language with sentences and philosophical ideas which are being espoused, and to understand the text means to understand those ideas. Just like if you want to speak language, you have to learn A, B, and C, and there is a certain amount of memorization and mimicry which is involved in learning a language. And there's just no way to learn a language without either being in an immersive environment where you mimic or where you hunker down and memorize. Those are your 2 options. But either one of them involves memorization and mimicry until you become so good at that the language becomes yours, and then you can start doing all sorts of amazing things with the language, even creating new words, new sentences, things that have never been said before. My daughter at the age of 5 constantly surprises me with her just incredible fluency in the English language, despite the fact she's 5. Because through mimicry, she's developed quite a vocabulary and a very, very nuanced understanding of language that would beat the best computer systems in the world to translate at the age of 5, which is crazy when you think about the processing power that the artificial intelligence designs that, which are primarily, like one of the main things they try to do is create a translation app, and they can't do it. But my daughter's like epic in creating original thoughts, stringing ideas together. And the mimicry has now become mastery as she's becoming fluent in language. Anyway, last week I spent a lot of time drilling into you guys A, B's, and C's because we're studying a text and there's constraints that are forced upon us because we're studying a text. Even if you want to disagree with it, you have to understand what it says in order to disagree with it. So there's just a certain amount of reading comprehension you need to have. And in many ways, hermeneutics and the ability to read a book and the ability to understand a book and reading comprehension, which is really a dumbed down way of saying hermeneutics, reading comprehension depends on certain memorized skills. That does not mean that once you've memorized things, you're now done. You can now begin to interact with the text in a more meaningful way, in a more powerful way, in a more beautiful and poetic way. So we drilled in some basic ideas that you have to memorize, like you have to memorize the way that pieces move on a chessboard. There's just no way around it. You have to memorize the way certain pieces move on a chessboard, and whether you do that through watching chess in an immersive environment without anybody ever telling you that's what's happening, or whether somebody sits down and tells you, here's how these pieces move. There is no way to play chess without learning how the pieces move. We did that last week. This week, what I want to do was get a little more interactive, although we were quite interactive last week, but get a little bit more exploratory and a little bit more interpretive and allow our minds to engage with the text in a non-rote way where we're not merely memorizing, but we are looking at the ideas and engaging with them creatively, a problem-solving way. So let's get warmed up by looking over a few verses. Let's start with text 11. I just want to get you guys warmed up to the text. Chapter 5, text 11, page 243 in my book. All right. Kayena manasa buddhya kevalai indriyai api. With the body, with the mind, with the intelligence, even just with the senses. Yogina karma kurvanti. The yogis do action. Sangam tyaktva, giving up attachment. Atma shuddhaye, for the purpose of purifying the self. For the purpose of purifying the self, the yogis give up attachment, and they do work with their body, with their mind, and even just with their senses. But the purpose of that is self-realization, self-purification. And they do so without attachment. You got it? All right. The yogis, abandoning attachment, act with body, mind, intelligence, and even with the senses, only for the purpose of purification. It's a super clean translation. You guys now understand the verse. Let's move on. Text 12. Yukta karma pala tyaktva shantim apnoti naishtikim ayukta karma karena pale sakto nibadyate. Yukta karma pala tyaktva. One who is yoga gives up attachment to the fruit. Shantim apnoti naishtikim. And he goes to the final peaceful place. He achieves the highest peace. He achieves the highest stage of peace. Not like he's going to death. He achieves. Apnoti means he achieves. What does he achieve? He achieves shantim, naishtikim. He achieves the highest peace. ayukta, but the one who's not yoga, kamakarina, he does things out of just desire. So he's not acting out of duty, he's not acting out of attachment, he's acting out of desire. And for him, pale sakto nibadyate, who's attached to the fruits, he's bound. They're bound. The steadily devoted soul attains unadulterated peace because he offers the result of all activities to me. Whereas a person who's not in union with the divine, who's greedy for the fruits of his labor, becomes entangled. You see Prabhupada there got a little more interpretive. He's offering the results to me. It's a little bit of an interpretive understanding of the term yukta, yogad, one who's in yoga. If you're in yoga, you're in touch with, you're in union with what? In union with the divine, and therefore you're offering the fruits of all your acts to the divine. That's the idea. And the last verse says they're doing stuff just for the purpose of self-realization. So that would mean their results are all being offered to the divine, as has been articulated in other sections of the Gita thus far. And so Prabhupada's little bit of poetic license isn't particularly problematic. But you see there Prabhupada giving a really literal translation of one verse and a little bit more of an interpretive translation of the last one. Sarva karmani manasa sanyasya aste sukam vasi navadvare pure dehi naiva kurvan nakarya. Sarva karmani manasa sanyasya aste sukam vasi. The self-controlled one sits happily, having renounced all actions in his mind. And the sannyasya is a compound word, sun, ni, and us. It means to put down, to throw down completely, to renounce. But Krishna made a point earlier, he said, Mayi sannyasya. You put everything down to me, you give it to me, in an earlier chapter. And so Prabhupada is probably picking up on this word sannyasya, that you're giving everything up and you're putting everything back down, you're giving it back. Who do you give it back to? To the Creator, to Krishna, and that's why the previous verse he translates the way he does. So it's not just that he's taking poetic license, but there's something in the verses that's making him feel inspired to be a little interpretive. I went with Atma Shuddhaye for the purpose of self-realization, but here sannyasa is actually a better reason why Prabhupada translated as giving it to the divine. In union with the divine, therefore giving it to the divine, because this verse says you put it down. So Sukam Vasi, he is self-controlled. He is happy. Aste Sukam, he's sitting. Like asana, it's from as. Sanni as, that's same. Sanni as, aste, asana, it's all the same root. And so he's putting it down, sitting it down, throwing it down. You're sitting down in a seat, an asana, which means a seat. And so he's sitting happily, vasi, he's self-controlled. Sanyasya manasa sarva karmani, all his actions are in his mind, he's given them all up. So he's doing them with his body, but in his mind he's renounced them. She's renounced them. Navadvare pure dehi. He's happily sitting in the city of 9 doors, of 9 gates, the embodied soul. And the 9 gates are 2 nostrils, 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, an anus and a rectum, an anus and a genital. So procreation, evacuation, speech, and eating, smelling, seeing, hearing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. City of 9 gates, the body. Dehi, the one who has a body, is Sukham Aste. He's sitting happily, Navadware Bure, in the city of 9 gates. Who? Vasi, the person who's self-controlled. Who? Manasa, who through his mind. Sanyasya, who's given up everything. Sarva Karmani, all his works. Naivam Kurvan Nakaryan. And he's neither working nor causing any other work to be done, nor causing anyone to work. So he's in this world, but he's in a neutral stage. He's neutrally engaged with the world. He's not doing anything. Although he's doing things, he's not doing anything. Why? Because he's given up the fruits. So he's actually as if he's done nothing, because his renunciation is such that even though he may be acting in the world, she may be acting in the world, they're actually not accumulating any karma. They're not doing anything. Just like, to give you an example that everybody can relate to, imagine if you are a police officer and you kill someone in the line of duty. Justified shoot. Have you committed a murder? No. Do you go to court? No. It's a justified shoot. You were doing your job. Therefore, what you did is as if you've done nothing. You haven't committed any crime. You haven't killed anybody. There's no sin which was committed. You're not punished. You're not looked down upon. Because you did exactly your duty and nothing more, nothing less. Or a soldier who goes to battle in a justified war. They're not punished. There are war crimes when you break the Geneva Convention and the rules of engagement and how you treat prisoners and such. But provided you follow the rules of war as universally agreed upon by Western nations post-World War I, then, because gas warfare was just too heinous, so after World War I, they got together and said, hey, wait a second, we need to come up with some basic rules of warfare and engagement. One of them was not using chemical warfare, because the mustard gas and the chlorine gas of World War I was just so hellish that everybody decided afterwards, let's just never do that again. The creeping death. So, although you may be killing someone with your gun, you may take aim and shoot somebody, it's not considered you've killed somebody. I mean, maybe they say confirmed kills, but there's no murder, there's no crime, you're not considered to have sinned. So it is possible in this world to do something that's your duty, that you're obliged to do, in accord with what you're supposed to be doing, and you're not in trouble for it, and you don't get any reaction for it, and you don't get punished for it. Even if that act is the most extreme, I gave the most extreme example I could think of, taking a life. What to speak of other things in this world. And so Krishna's making a very, very powerful point. He's saying that there's a stage of life you can get to where you're detached from your actions, you're acting as you're obliged to by duty for the purpose of self-realization. It's not from ego. And although you're acting in the world and you're moving in the world, you're actually standing still. And you're not accumulating more karma. Of course, if you believe in God, you have to believe in this. Could an all-powerful God make a world in which, if you acted according to your duty, you did not accrue any new karma? Yes, an all-powerful God could do that. That's what the meaning of all-powerful is. You guys should have answered more quickly. Would an all-good God want to do that? Yes, an all-good God would want to do that because that's the best of all possible worlds. Could an all-powerful God make a world where no one got any karma for doing anything at all? Yes, they could. It would be called an antinomian world. Would an all-good God want to make such a world? No, because there'd be no chance of learning. Also, people would be able to do terrible stuff to each other. It would be an unfair world. So even if you go to it through its circuitous route, if you believe in all good, all-powerful God, then this is the world you believe in. Alternatively, you can extrapolate from your own experience, and we can look at the world. We can say, are there certain things you can do, and you're still neutral, you're not affected, you're not enmeshed, you're not contaminated. Have you ever acted in this world without becoming enmeshed? Have you ever done your duty and been satisfied just in doing your duty without becoming entangled? The answer, of course, is yes for everybody who thinks about it for a few minutes. Could you do that across the board? I don't see why it would be illogical that you could do that across the board. It may look differently, like the swing of the blacksmith's hammer may look different, but it could hit the same point every time, which is that you do the right thing for the right reason, even if your actions look a little different from the day to day. When the embodied being controls his nature and mentally renounces all actions, he resides happily in the city of 9 gates, neither working nor causing work to be done. Pretty clean translation, right? Yeah. Pretty clean, super clean translation. Literal. Super clean. All right, now we're warmed up. That was all a warm-up. Now we're going to engage with the text. These verses are slightly intermediate. They're slightly enigmatic. The meaning of them is not the meaning of them is apparent. There are several layers to meaning to these next verses. And there's nuance in these verses. See if you can pick it up. It's a little advanced. What's especially important is to understand who is the subject of these verses. I'll give you that hint. Na kartritvam, na karmani, lokasya, srijati prabhu. The Prabhu does not create the actions or even the agency. You guys know what agency is? Kartri in Sanskrit means actor or doer. The person who will do action is called the Kartri. The subject of a sentence is called the Kartri. Grammatically, in grammar, the one who's doing the action is called Kartri. So kartritvam, the doerness, which agency, the ability to do things. Do children have free agency? Interesting question, right? Do children under the age of 10 have free agency? They have some free agency. They make all sorts of moves. I made all sorts of moves when I was 10. I did this, did that, made choices. But legally, we don't consider children under a certain age to have agency. That's why they have to be protected by their family. They don't have free agency. Legally speaking, they don't have free agency. In the eyes of the law, they have free agency. So, agency, the ability to act, the freedom to act. Kartritva, doerness. Na karmani, not actions, not agency. Lokasya srijati prabhu. The Prabhu does not create the actions or even the ability to act for the people. Prabhu means powerful one. Bhu means to be in Sanskrit. It's the verbal root for to be. And so Prabhu is the powerful being. The Prabhu does not create the actions or the agency of the people. Who does Prabhu refer to? Let's keep going. Na karma phala samyogam. Also, the Prabhu does not create the union of action and fruit. Samyoga, the union of karma, phala, of action and fruit, that's also not created by the Prabhu. In other words, he doesn't create the cause and effect scenario. He doesn't create actions. He doesn't create agency. Swabhava tu pravartate. All that is turning according to swabhav. Swabhav means one's innate nature. Bhav also comes from bhu, to be, and bhav means nature, swabhav, one's own nature. Swabhava tu pravartate. This is all turning, proceeding from swabhav. Next verse. Na adate kasyachit papam na chaiva sukritam vibhu. The vibhu, same root, bhu, to be. Vibhu means, again, literally the powerful one. Can also mean it's a little technical, but pra and vi are prefixes that modify the verbs. Pra intensifies, and vi also intensifies, but sometimes in a different way. And so bhu means being, and so vibhu means kind of great being, expansive being, and so vibhu oftentimes means the expansive one, the all-pervading one. Can also just as easily mean the powerful one. Prabhu and vibhu can be synonyms. So this sentence has the vibhu. The vibhu na adate kasyachit papam. The vibhu does not accept anyone's sin. Na chaiva sukritam, nor anyone's piety. Ajnanena vritam jnanam tena muhyanti jantava. Those who are born, their knowledge is covered by ignorance, and by that they become bewildered. For those who are born, their knowledge is covered by ignorance, and by that ignorance they become muhyanti, they become bewildered, beguiled. Let's look over these two verses again. Na kartritvam na karmani lokasya srijati prabhu. The Prabhu, the powerful one, does not create agency or action. Na karma phala samyogam. Or even the cause and effect situation of action and the fruit of action. Swabhava tu pravartate. All that's happening because of swabhav, because of innate nature. One's innate nature. Na adate kasyachit papam, na chaiva sukritam vibhu. The vibhu does not accept anyone's sin or anyone's piety. Rather, again, avritam jnanam tena muhyanti jantava. A living being is covered, their knowledge is covered by ignorance, and by that ignorance they become bewildered. What do these verses mean? Yeah. And when I say what do these verses mean, you can relate these verses to the chapter, to the preceding verses, which is why we read them. You can understand what these verses mean philosophically. I've told you especially what I'd like us to try to define, which is the subject of the sentence, the Prabhu and the Vibhu. Who is that referring to? And there are many things said in the verse that warrant mentioning. So those are some things, but there are more. These verses contain important information, and it's information that requires a little bit of unpacking, in my opinion. And so I want to give you guys some freedom now to try to understand and argue for the meaning of the verse. It could be a minor point, it could be a major point, but I want you guys to engage with the verse. And if somebody says your thing, do not repeat it if it came from them. Do not take credit for what anybody else has said. Only take credit for your own original thoughts. However, if somebody says something you were thinking of saying, then you can say it again. I'm trusting you to be honest about it.
Prabhu, I believe, is the soul, and it's explaining that the soul does not create agency, does not create action, does not take on any karma from action. And then the vibhu is...
Hold on. So Prabhu means the soul. The soul does not create action or agency or the union of action to its fruit. Who are those things created by?
The living being, like the body, essentially.
The body creates those things.
Your nature.
Your nature creates those things. How is your nature not you?
Yeah, your soul is distinct from your body and your nature.
Okay, so your nature means your material nature. Okay, so swabhava means your material nature. That's creating all the bad stuff. You as the soul stand aloof from free will. So the soul does not have free will. Damn. You were doing good, right?
The soul does have...
Hold on. Stop. Just stop right there. You'll get another bite from the apple. Do you see what happened? Don't try to just... If you encounter a problem with what you're saying, don't try to just overcome it. You can try. You won't succeed. You may not have the ability to move so quickly and notice that that was a major problem. The soul does not have free will.
I believe the soul does have free will, but in this current situation, we're bewildered and we're choosing to be bewildered. We're choosing to have ignorance.
But that would mean we have free will. We're choosing to be bewildered means we have free will. Therefore, your interpretation of this verse as referring to the soul would seem to not work. Because to say the soul has no agency is problematic. To say the soul has no karma, we could do that. To say the soul doesn't interact with your even the fruits of karma. Okay, the body does, not the soul. We could do that. But to say the soul has no agency, it's a little more problematic, isn't it? Okay, let's keep going. Yes. By the way, I'm going to throw something to help you out in a minute. I just want to get some stuff on the table. Yeah.
These verses seem problematic when reading them, especially right after the verses we just read, because, first of all, I think that Prabhu is Arjuna, and in the previous verses, Arjuna got to make a choice and take action, and there were results of his action. And now Krishna is saying that...
Okay, so the verse is problematic because Arjuna just automatically, by Krishna giving advice to Arjuna, he acknowledges Arjuna's free will. If I attempt to persuade you to do something, the very act of me attempting to persuade you to do something means I have now tacitly accepted that you have free will. If I say, Kumi, we should go get burritos after the program, would you like to do that? The mere fact I'm asking you, or I'm saying, and here's why we should get burritos. The mere fact that I'm giving a persuasive argument, I'm presenting evidence, or I'm asking you to do something, the very fact I'm doing that means I recognize you have free will and you can choose to either do it or not do it. Therefore, Krishna has acknowledged Arjuna's agency throughout the Gita. So now if Arjuna is the Prabhu, then this verse is problematic because it indicates Arjuna has no agency. Okay? That's a problem. Good. You got more? Okay, keep going.
It's also problematic because it seems to purport determinism, that like we don't have any choice.
Okay, the verse seems to indicate determinism because we have no choice, we have no agency, we have no free will, and therefore everything is being done by something else, which isn't us, and therefore we're on a conveyor belt, and we have no free will, and that's a serious problem for theism, because determinism leads to atheism or the belief in an evil God, because only an evil God would not give you free will. Because a world with free will is better than a world without free will. And for people to suffer, and they didn't do anything to suffer, it was happening automatically against their will, would mean that God was evil. The same way if you create a child, made him suffer for no good reason, that would be a problem. Okay, we got 2 problems from you. Yes?
I think also what's important is that part of the knower who is in union with the awareness that there is no doing, not doing. I just thought that might also be relevant.
I don't know what you're saying.
Like how he's talking about the knower, the Prabhu.
The Prabhu, the powerful one. The Prabhu isn't the knower. The Prabhu is the powerful one. Anyway, go ahead.
I thought maybe there was relevance there to the fact that he's aware that he's not doing and doing at the same time.
I mean, he's powerful enough to be aware of his non-complicity. Okay, sure, if the Prabhu is not us, if the Prabhu is us, which both of them have said, then the Prabhu is bewilderable. You follow? So that's an issue, right? You get it? I'll come back to you in a minute. More engagement with the verse. Yeah.
I think he's saying the Prabhu is the master of the senses, because he says he starts to talk about the person who controls his nature and how the city of 9 gates is where he's residing happily. And this next verse about the Supreme Lord.
Okay, so the Prabhu is the soul who is situated happily in the city of 9 gates, and is Vasi, who self-controls, who's Sukham Aste, who's seated happily, Nava Dvare Pure, in the city of 9 gates, who is na karmani nakaryan, who's not, or nakurvan nakaryan, who's not acting and not causing anyone to act. That self-realized soul is the Prabhu. And therefore that person's not doing anything and has no agency because they're not enmeshed in the material world. Therefore, having no agency doesn't mean you don't have free will. It means you have used your free will appropriately to disengage from the material world, and now you have no more agency or investment in the material world, and you're no longer engaging with the material world. This is the point you're trying to make? Okay? Good. It's a good, solid point. Comes at it from a different angle than you, but gets where he wants to get. And I think your arguments go together real well. I think his argument also solves your dilemma. I think both the problems that you guys came up with, I can't remember your second problem, but your first problem is solved by what he said. Because now we are saying that the no agency means you're not invested in the material world, you're not engaging with the material world, you're spiritually situated. And so, shantim naishtikam apnoti, you've achieved eternal peace, and you're engaged in the world, but you're not acting in this world, right? And even the analogy I gave supports that idea, right? Okay? Good work. And you got something on Vibhu also.
Yeah, so it doesn't create any contradiction in the verse, the Supreme Lord not assuming any sinful or pious activities, when we conceive of those as the material nature acting, and the Jiva and Brahman being eternal and unaffected.
Thank you for coming. Go ahead.
There's no contradiction in verse 15. The Supreme Lord not assuming any sinful or pious activities, because both the Jiva and the Supreme Lord are unchanging.
So the verse 15 is about, who's the subject? Who's the Vibhu?
Well, the Vibhu is about the Supreme Lord.
Okay. And why did we switch? Why is the Prabhu about the individual soul and the Vibhu is about the Supreme Lord?
He's advancing his argument and he's changing subjects to...
No, what I'm asking is, what is it about the Vibhu that's different than the Prabhu that makes it necessary for us to move to Vibhu being the Supreme Lord as opposed to Prabhu meaning the individual soul? What is it in verse 15 that applies to God? Yes, take prasad. What is it that applies to God in verse 15? That he doesn't accept anyone's sins?
In verse 14, he's explaining how the Prabhu is unaffected, and now he's explaining how the Supreme Lord is unaffected in a similar way.
Okay. Good. All right. what stops us from viewing both of them being about the individual soul? The individual soul does not accept any sin or any piety, but rather living beings. So the soul doesn't do that. The soul is aloof from karma. Just as the soul, if you're going to go as far as say the soul has no agency, and is not even involved in the union not creating any connection between karma and pal, between action and fruit, between cause and effect, and not creating anybody's karma or agency. That verse would seem it could very easily apply to God, and then text 15, not accepting any sin or not accepting any good karma, that would seem to very easily also apply to the soul. And in fact, I would say arguably that text 14 sounds more like God, does not create any cause and effect, does not create any agency, does not create anybody's actions. That sounds like God setting up the universe. And then this one is no sin, no piety. That sounds quite a bit like the individual soul. So why have you said the first verse was about the individual soul and the second verse was about the Supreme Lord?
Well, a big part of the second verse being about the Supreme Lord is because that's how Prabhupada takes it.
That's right. You took Prabhupada's translation, but you didn't look at the verse. And so you went with that. I'm not saying it's wrong, but that's where it came from. It did not come from looking at the verse. And in fact, if we look at it, tell me how viewing text 15 as the Supreme Lord is better than viewing text 14 as the Supreme Lord. I don't think you'll be able to. And tell me if you're going to view text 14 as the individual soul, why you can't view text 15 as the individual soul. I don't believe you can tell me.
Well, text 15 answers the question of, God would be sort of biased if he was accepting pious activities and impious activities. So to make himself, Krishna, not be biased, he's presenting the argument in this way to show himself to be a neutral party in this circumstance.
How is it not neutral to say you don't create agency or karma or even the cause and effect of the universe? How is that any less indicative of neutrality?
Because he's giving the jiva free will. So he's saying the jiva has free will. And then, in addition...
Okay, but then that would have verse 14 being about God. If verse 14 is about free will and aloofness from the entire process of what's going on in the universe, then that would be about God's creating the universe and being aloof. It's like it would be the equivalent of saying, this last verse must be about God because otherwise God would be like saying, it's like $100 bet. But the previous verse is about the individual soul, even though it's about $1 billion bet. The 14th verse is way more applicable to God. It's about the very nature of the cosmos and the structure of the cosmos. Are you guys following my argument? What's your response? In other words, it's such a higher level of non-biasness. Text 14. So say text 15 has to be about God, but text 14 is about the individual soul. I don't see how the criteria that led you to believe that works. All I can say is you blindly accepted Prabhupada's translation. And now you're trying to justify it not very well. More. Dhruv. Feel free to argue with me, by the way. That's what we're doing here.
Two things. In verse 15, the word vibhu and jantava are used to refer to two different groups.
This is correct. Absolutely. I mean, they could be two different groups. They are two different subjects of the sentence. Yes. So jantava means like born beings. So the janta, and it's in the plural. So that's in the plural. Vibhu's in the singular. They're both subjects of the sentence, for sure. And it almost reads like two sentences. So the vibhu does not accept anyone's pop or anyone's good qualities. And the jantava, the embodied souls, their ignorance covers their knowledge. And by that they are bewildered. Yes?
And so I was going to say that seems to indicate that the jantava, being in a body refers to the soul, whereas vibhu is without a body, or at least not without a material.
Jantava being in the plural and being bewildered seems to refer to souls. Vibhu seems to then refer to somebody other than the souls, therefore God. Problem is, Prabhu, also the soul, is in the singular in the last verse. And the glorification of the Prabhu is more excessive than the glorification of the Vibhu. So now you're glorifying the soul with higher praise. In other words, I want to just say this in English. The Prabhu does not create agency, does not create anyone's karma. Lokasya srijati karma. Does not create any of the karma of the world. Nakartritvam. Does not even create agency. Nak karma pala samyogam. Does not create the union of cause and effect. That's the Prabhu. It's like very high praise, isn't it? It's very high praise, right? And so to now argue that the Prabhu is the individual soul referred to in the singular, but the Vibhu is the Supreme Lord because it's in the singular, doesn't make sense because we've already accepted that Prabhu can refer to the individual soul in the preceding verse. Did you follow that? And you can say that. The soul, if I say the soul is pure, do I mean one soul or do I mean all souls? I mean all souls. So in English, you can speak in the singular about an entire class of beings. That's totally appropriate. And I'm speaking about you in your ultimate spiritual essence versus you in your corporeal existence. Your existence in this world in a body. Did you follow that? Does that make sense? You got more?
I have one other potential argument. It feels a little bit weaker, but...
I mean, that one was weak. So this one's weaker. Let's just skip it for a minute. I want to cut it off at some point, but I want to give everybody a chance to speak. So yes.
Something I like about the verses.
Good. Certainly.
I know we're zooming in on 14:15.
No, you do your thing, man.
What struck me about those verses is how it switched to the negative. The embodied does not create activities, nor does it. And then,
Yeah, that's called, by the way, that's called via negativa or apophatic theology. It's when you describe something by way of negation. You say what it's not instead of what it is.
I didn't go too far back from the 11th, 12th, 13th. It's all talking about more positive, like what the soul is doing.
Atma Shuddhaya. He's acting for the purpose of self-realization. Sannyasya. He's putting things back. Sukham aste. He's seated happily. And so there's much more positive language. There's some negative language in those verses also, but there's much more positive language.
But to me, that switch, they're not pretty sharp from that positive language
I agree.
to the negative
Great point.
in the 14th.
Great point. Excellent point. Excellent observation. Good. Great way to engage with the verses. Yeah. You had something?
Oh, no, I was checking right here.
Okay. All right. Who else wants to go? I see. I'm going to go in order. I'll give Ross and then Shri and then JC. Anybody else want to go? You got something?
Probably not.
Just try. It's okay. We're trying to be creative now. And I'm kicking you guys because the thing is, when you're trying to be creative, it's not that every single creative thing you do works. So part of being creative is failing. Part of being creative is failing and getting resistance, because then if you can stay creative and not become depressed, then you start to unlock new avenues that might be successful, whereas previous avenues weren't, and you learn in a way you couldn't possibly learn by memorization. Yes?
that switch from positive to negative is where I think he switched from like talking about the individual soul to the more universal just being
All souls.
all souls.
Sure. Okay, good. Thank you.
We can't really talk about all souls.
Yeah, thank you. Good. Thank you, man. Right. You can't say what God is. You can only say what God is not. It's a very common thing that human language is limited, and therefore you can't possibly contain the absolute within limited language, and therefore you describe God by way of negation to try to hint at something which is beyond language. Excellent. Excellent. Thoughtful points. Good stuff. Okay, back to you.
I have
Hold on, Kumi, you had something.
Well, I was just trying to link Prabhu with some of the distinctions we learned in previous chapters, and to me, the Prabhu was most closely related to sannyas.
Good. So the word Prabhu would easily be a word that could be used for a self-realized soul. Excellent. The word Prabhu literally means something, not literally, but something along the lines of Lord. It's a term which is used both for God as well as the individual soul, more often for God. Just FYI. Okay, go, quick.
I have a potential resolution of the
Yep, go for it.
1 from 14.
Yeah, go.
Okay, so 14, I was thinking that the free will of the soul is only whether to turn towards.
Good. Or what he said, once you give up engaging with the world, you've kind of gone beyond your agency in this world. You're no longer invested in this world. So you're free, but you don't have agency where you're creating karma. If you understand agency to be not a universal agency, but agency to do things that get you karma in this world, then once you check out from this world because you're self-realized, you no longer have agency in this world in the sense that you're no longer creating karma for yourself. And that resolution works. Does that make sense? Okay, you.
I would like to argue for why verse 14.
And that was, I think, a little better version of what you wanted to get to. Go.
I want to argue for why verse 14 is about Prabhu and not about, is about Arjuna. And it's because Krishna's arguing that Prabhu is distinct from the modes of material nature.
Yes?
And Krishna, obviously God, includes the modes of material nature because they come from God. And so if
No. God is beyond the modes of material nature. They come from him indirectly. But there is a game of sleight of hand where the material world, and we're not going to make I want to be in 60 minutes. It's just not going to happen. I kept trying to rush it, but it's not going to happen. Here's the deal. If you say that God creates the material world and karma and this and that, pretty soon you have a God who's no longer fully divine. So to say that we are fully divine, but then God's not fully divine, is seriously, insanely problematic. It is such a colossal problem that you are essentially destroying a theology by making that massive faux pas. And so we have to do this little game of sleight of hand. It's like what atheists do. Consciousness is just, it seems like it's a real thing, but it's actually not. It's just electrical synaptic firings, being conducted by chemistry and biology. You follow? And so, but yeah, it seems like we got free will, but actually we don't. They got it because they can't acknowledge free will and individuality and the soul because their model of everything, the world coming from physics, chemistry coming from physics, biology coming from chemistry, and therefore the world ultimately breaks down to chemistry, does not allow for things like an irreducible free will. And even with an emergent phenomenon, the emergent phenomenon is ultimately traceable back to its precursor state. It just has wild behavior that you would have expected, but once you can work back, you can exactly see where it came from. So you can't have this irreducibility of the soul. Similarly, if you start with God, you can't really argue that matter comes from God. Because then you'll be saying something material comes from something spiritual. You follow? And so God created the world from nothing in 7 days. Ex nihilo, from nothing. What we say is the material world isn't actually all that material. And with a proper spiritual understanding, the line between matter and spirit starts to blur, and you start to discover the spirituality of everything. That's our solution. But you've got to walk dexterously and carefully down that road. But saying that God is the source of material nature, so much of our text is designed, because we're a monistic system that says everything comes from one source, so much of our texts are designed to remind us that Krishna is nirguna, beyond the gunas. Otherwise, Krishna would be innately material, and then you as a pure soul would ultimately be above God. You see that? It just doesn't work, does it? Okay. So you stepped on a colossal landmine. That's okay. You got to step on those landmines so you know to avoid them for the rest of your life. Moving into these verses now, I personally, and the commentators, it's like your choice. Prabhu and Vibhu could refer to Krishna. They could refer to Paramatma, the creator of the material world, the derivative form. They could refer to the individual soul. There's nothing in the verses which makes it have to be one versus the other. Has no agency, can just be understood to be, is not materially entangled in cause and effect. Does not create cause and effect. It either be did not create the entire system of cause and effect, or is no longer playing that game of cause and effect because they're detached from the effect. The previous verse said they're not attached to the fruit, therefore they're no longer playing the game of cause and effect. You follow? They're not creating anybody's karma. Yeah, you're not creating any more karma because you're sitting happily in the city of 9 gates because you're not doing anything. Therefore, the verse could easily refer to the individual soul. Could also refer to God, who also is just like the soul in all those same ways, and also did not create this system either. Rather, your own desires as Swabhav created this system. You follow? Or, you didn't create the system, your material nature creates it. Then that's a problem, because how did we get here? Where did the Swabhav come from? When did the pure soul create a Swabhav? And now you get to the problem of evil. And this is really verses dealing with the problem of evil. And they don't do so particularly effectively, because they just blame something called Swabhav. But that does give us some freedom to engage with what that Swabhav might mean. You follow? It does. Also, it says their knowledge is covered by ignorance. It's a very interesting way to frame it. Your knowledge then is your innate state. But none of you mentioned this. Knowledge is your innate state. Although it was negative language, it's actually a very positive premise to the verse. That your innate stage is to be of knowledge. You got something? You want to say something? I'd like to hear from you. I see you got notes, and you guys are like comparing notes. Tell me.
I think that part was the part I was trying to engage with before about the knowledge covering, like the ignorance and knowledge part. I'm not very familiar with it. That's the part
Yeah, no, you noticed that. I'm sorry. You know what? Forgive me. You did notice that. I forgot. You did notice that. I thought it was fantastic. For me, that's a very powerful part of the verse. So it's interesting. Swabhav, innate nature, gets blamed for essentially evil. Then Swabhav is swapped out for ignorance. And ignorance covers the soul, which means the soul is luminous. And in fact, the subsequent verse will say that the soul is luminous. And the sun-like soul destroys the ignorance that's covering it. So it's a covering. It's not you. It's a covering on top of you. So now there's nothing like evil. There's no innate fundamental force of evil, but there is something called ignorance. And how does ignorance affect you? The verse doesn't tell us. So where does ignorance come from? Now, the verse should be about God, because God also didn't create ignorance. Otherwise, God's evil. The soul didn't create ignorance. But the soul, I'd more want to say the soul created ignorance than God created ignorance, because I want to blame us for the bad stuff in the world instead of blaming God. You follow? So I've got to massage these verses in some direction. And they could either be about God or about the individual soul. But although they don't really give us a fleshed out, detailed answer, the way we do in a dualistic system where you really have to dig into where did evil come from, they do give us the skeleton, and we can then paint a picture and just make sure we don't go against the framework. Could we say that, yes, you have no agency in this world, you exist as a pure soul, but you chose to engage with this world? And in that sense, you always have agency. But you can also choose not to engage, in which case materially you'll have no agency. Materially, you'll no longer be involved in cause and effect. Even though you may be acting with body, mind, and words, but you're only acting for the purpose of self-realization. And so then you have no more karma. You truly exist aloof from the material world. But ultimately, you are responsible for having gotten here in the first place, and you're also responsible for letting go. Does that work with the verses? Sure, we are filling in blanks. We're not contradicting the verse. We're massaging the language a little bit, and we're filling in blanks. You get it? And the option for ignorance is always there. And God allows that option to be there, but you choose to exploit that option and indulge in ignorance. Therefore, it's your choice that you got to this world, and that ignorance covers you, but it never actually infects you. And then through the process of self-realization, you're able to remove that covering of ignorance, and you realize who you always were, a pure soul who has nothing to do with this material world. And actually the material world is very much like a dream. And the material world is only material as long as you buy into it. Just like the virtual reality is only reality until you realize, oh, wait a second, I can take these goggles off. And actually there's a whole other world here. And therefore the Upanishad statements that the world's like a dream. Ignorance covering us, but not infecting us. Us ultimately having no agency, God having no agency, but we did on some level, somewhere, make a choice. And that's being referred to as swabhav. It's your own innate nature that you chose to do that. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's your fundamental nature. It means somewhere along the way you made some choice and that became your innate nature, not innate with a capital I, but innate with a lowercase I, such that you're covered, but you could become uncovered. You see how nuanced it is? These verses allow for that kind of troubleshooting, that kind of theologizing. Vedic scriptures in general are pretty weak on the whole free will, problem of evil scenario, because they had no concept of evil, so it wasn't as big of a deal for people. They didn't have to account for this real fundamental thing. It was a dream. It was an illusion. It was like not the reality. Ultimately, spirituality was the reality, and you had to wake up to that. And then the ignorance evaporates like dew in the morning time, like fog in the morning time, which is actually what's described in the next verse. And so the next verse says, we'll just go ahead and include it just so you guys can really get an appreciation. Jnanena tu tat ajnanam yesham nashitam atmanaha. But for those who destroy the ignorance with knowledge, the ignorance of the self with knowledge. Tesham, for them, adityavat jnanam. Jnana is like the sun. Prakashayan tat param. That illuminates that supreme. But for those who destroy ignorance with knowledge, the ignorance of the self with knowledge, that knowledge becomes like a sun that illuminates everything, including the supreme. See the mood of the verses? So certainly the verses could easily be about the soul. They could be about the soul and God. They could be about God. Certain portions of the verse have to be about the soul. You know, jantava, living beings become bewildered. That has to be about the soul. There's no way around that. Certain things have to be about the soul. Swabhavatu pravartate, that it's all happening by swabhav. That has to be about our nature. Because you say it's from God, then God becomes evil. So these verses are open to interpretation. They're somewhat enigmatic. The commentators have a field day with them. They all interpret them in a variety of ways. And we can also engage with these verses, troubleshoot the problem of evil, let these verses be some kind of a framework, and we can work with them. And in fact, they work for the soul. They work for God. Prabhu can mean God. Vibhu can mean soul. Vibhu more means God than Prabhu, but both of them primarily mean God. And the verses, the substance of the verses works really well for both the soul or God. That's me engaging with the verses. And I don't think I've said everything. I've laid out some responses to you guys and some of my own thoughts in relation to your thoughts. But I wanted to give you guys a chance to stretch out and play with the verses, spread your wings and fly a little bit, see what you saw, troubleshoot, come up against a little bit of, what do I want to say, opposition, try to overcome it, abandon certain lines of reasoning, adopt other ones, start to put together an understanding of things. You happen to just step in on a landmine, which allowed me to talk about what I want to talk about anyway, which is that these verses get almost as close as you get to the concept of evil in the Gita, which is the concept of ignorance and your nature carrying you from one lifetime to another. Your acquired nature by misuse of your free will, which is ultimately your responsibility. But isn't ultimately you, because even you appear to be in matter, because you want to turn away from God, because you didn't look towards divinity. But you can never really not look towards divinity because God's everywhere. So that's an illusion that you're not looking towards divinity. But then you wake up, you realize, oh, I've always been looking at divinity. The material world melts away. And you see the Supreme. Do you guys follow that? And the verses get really beautiful. We'll go over these next week, but just these two next verses are they're astounding. Tat budhayas, tat atmanas, tat nishtas, tat parayana. For those who are, their intelligence is always focused on that. Their self is always focused on that. They are always established in that. They hold that as the highest object. Gashati apunar avritam. They go to a place where there's no return. Heaven. Avritam means return, and apunar means not again. So go to a place where you don't again return from. Jnana nirduta kalmasha. Because they've shaken off the dirt by jnana. The dirt of ignorance, they've shaken it off by jnana. It wasn't them, they shook it off. The dirt of ignorance was shaken off by jnana. Beautiful, right? And then the next verse. Vidya vinaya sampane. Okay, so pandita samadarshina. The learned person sees with equal vision. A Brahmin endowed with learning and culture, a cow, an elephant, a dog cooker. The Pandit sees all of them equally, sees the soul in all of them, sees the beauty in all of them, sees beneath the surface the reality of the world, that everything is ultimately spiritual. You follow? The material distinctions melt away. He's able to see the spiritual reality. Because the illusion of ignorance, the illusion created by Swabhav, is not ultimately us. So not only did God not create ignorance, in some ways we didn't create ignorance either, because it's all extrinsic to ourselves. So we turned away from divinity, but there's no way to turn away from divinity. So God has to create some facility to beguile you if you want to turn away from divinity. Otherwise you wouldn't have the ability to choose to love God and turn towards God. We did that. We're now enmeshed in this material world, but ultimately we can wake up from this enmeshment and become detached from it. Just like waking up from a dream in the sun and everything melts away. You know, sometimes you have a horrible dream and you wake up, you're like, oh my God, fantastic, it was just a dream. And pretty soon it's just gone. It's like, even you're traumatized in your dream, you have a horrible nightmare. But then you wake up and it's like it didn't even exist. You can't even really remember it. It's not like if you get hurt in this world and you remember it. The dream is different, isn't it? It never really existed. The whole material world's like that. You know, by and large, somebody suffers extreme sexual abuse, extreme physical abuse, really torture. There's no recovery. It's kind of hardwired into you, that trauma response. You can navigate around it. You can learn technologies, but it'll always be a part of you. I don't actually believe that, because we're souls. It all shakes off. None of it's you. Part of realizing that, accepting it, and not running from it and not trying to escape it. But ultimately, it all shakes off. It's a far out worldview. There's some beautiful stuff in here. This stuff, it shakes off. The dirt shakes off. Knowledge illuminates like the sun. You're covered by ignorance, but your basic state is knowledge. That we're all beyond this world, including God. That, ignorance is there. All that's from the verses. And the source of that ignorance we have to then tease out. And the source of that ignorance is us and our turning away from divinity. Instead of becoming Krishna Unmukh, turning towards Krishna, we became Krishna Bahirmukh. We turned away from Krishna. Who's to blame for that? We're to blame for that. Any other explanation leads to absurdities and the destruction of the theology. Therefore, irrespective of whether the Indian pundits really got into this or not, and whether they spent a lot of time with it, because they were struggling with a dualistic worldview, they didn't, because they weren't. They got into other stuff that was important to them. And so we may have to get into a little bit of that. It's because of our upbringing in a dualistic world, our concept of a pure evil. And so these verses offer us a springboard. They offer us some clues. They offer us a framework to work within, to stay within our tradition, but troubleshoot this stuff. And there's room for a little bit of creativity. But it doesn't mean you can do anything. Does that make sense? Okay. I think we're good. Thank you so much.